Hi. Today we get to start talking about World War II for all those who are waiting for this. And the question of the day is to think about how it is that a world that was totally committed after World War I to the idea of preventing all future wars could have managed to get themselves into another war and missed all the opportunities that they might have had to stop a war in 1936 and to 1939. So that's the question that'll be your writing assignment. So you want to be thinking about that all along. What should they have done differently? You probably remember that the Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to ruin the enemies of France and Britain, actually made more enemies. Didn't it? Made Germany into a worse enemy. It made Japan into an enemy. It made Italy into an enemy. Another factor to keep thinking about is how people sometimes overreact to learning a lesson. So World War I taught the countries of the world that it's a bad idea to jump into a fight when you just for something little like the assassination of the Archduke. Um, and maybe as the Second World War approached, countries were thinking, oh, let's not overreact. Let's not react to small things. Let's stay out of it. And they actually made an error in the opposite direction. Now let's think a little bit more about which countries were in a position to do something and what they were dealing with internally. So think about France and Great Britain. They both lost a lot of people in the war, World War I. And Great Britain in particular lost a lot of its navy, which was sunk by German submarines in World War I. France had all their land in northern France that was just completely wrecked by trench warfare. So both countries were really anxious to spend as much time as they could recovering from war and not getting into other wars. And while they came out of World War I allies to each other, France and Britain were pretty suspicious about everybody else in Europe who they thought maybe hadn't done enough to help out in World War I. And so they were hesitant to form friendships or relationships with other countries. They were afraid of having alliances that would lead them into trouble, just like they got into trouble in World War I. The people of France and Britain were disgusted by war and all the death and destruction that had happened and really did not want a new war. Also, in 1929, a depression started around the world, the greatest economic depression we've had up until now. And folks were very focused on dealing with their economic problems and didn't want to have to deal with anything else. In the United States, very few people died in World War I, and we actually made a profit off of the war. So you might have think, well, the U.S. would be big on war after that experience, but actually people in the U.S. were really isolationists. They didn't believe in having anything to do with Europe. They didn't want to be part of the League of Nations, you'll remember. They were just generally turning inward and trying not to be involved in the outside world. And then the Depression started, and that reinforced people's feeling that they didn't have time to take care of the problems of the rest of the world. In the Soviet Union, probably the worst losses of World War I, right? They lost millions and millions of people. Their government changed hands in a revolution. Valuable land was lost forever. The Treaty of Versailles treated the Russians like enemies. They weren't invited to discuss it. Their land was given away to other countries. France, Britain, and the United States actually all supported the Tsar and the white Russian revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks in the civil war that happened right after the revolution. And consequently, Stalin and the Bolsheviks hated the United States, France, and Britain and didn't trust them for good reasons. Also, Russia is trying to industrialize after World War I, and Stalin wanted to use every resource that he had to build up his industrial capacity, not to prepare for war. So everybody had a huge incentive to stay out of it. Meanwhile, Italy was becoming aggressive and wanting to take over other countries. And so you know about Mussolini taking power in Italy, and you know that his first move after consolidating his power was to take over Ethiopia. So here you have a picture of fascism growing in Ethiopia, or being imposed in Ethiopia. You might remember that the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie actually fought against this, and then went to the League of Nations and talked about the need to stop Italy in its tracks, to catch them early, to understand the dangers of fascism and do something about it right away. The world ignored his warnings. The League of Nations declined to comment on the takeover of Ethiopia. And then Hitler came on the scene in 1933, and he started talking about this idea of Lebensraum, that Germany was too small after the Treaty of Versailles and needed to enlarge itself in order to accommodate all the German people. It needed living room, Lebensraum. And so we know that he rebuilt the German army, and that he took over the Rhineland on the border with France. All of this was aggression. All of this was breaking the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France could have decided to start a war that would have taken care of Hitler at this point, but they chose not to. Maybe they felt guilty about having taken too much from Germany. So Hitler and Mussolini formed an alliance and started looking around the world for opportunities to build their power. What came up was Spain. In Spain, there was a democratic government and the people of Spain elected a large number of communist, socialist, and anarchist organizations into government. You might think, well, anarchist organizations don't want to be in government, but actually these are what they call anarcho-syndicalists, people who believe in small-scale co-ops, and they were a big part of the Spanish government, especially in the northern parts of Spain. The folks who don't like these ideas, including a guy named Franco and his political party, which was called the Phalangists, staged a coup against the elected government of Spain, and then began targeting the groups, the communist groups, the anarchist groups in the north of Spain, to eliminate them and get rid of their opposition. So this is the situation that Mussolini and Hitler decided to jump into in support of Franco, who was a fascist. The way that Germany was able to support the war in Spain on behalf of the fascists there was to target the cities where socialists and anarchists had their biggest following. But we're talking about heavily populated cities, and cities that had no air defense. So the German bombing campaign, which really looked like a kind of practice session, an experiment in what it was like to use aerial bombing in a war, just obliterated cities in the north. And this is the city of Guernica, one of the most famous targets of the Hitler Air Force. Pablo Picasso, a famous painter who you might have heard about, painted a painting about Guernica and what happened. This is actually a room-sized painting that you can see if you go to the art museum in Madrid. And he tried to capture what it felt like to be in Guernica in that bombing campaign. You might want to look at some of the details here. There's the dead baby, the dying horse, this light bulb that also looks like an eye. Some people think these are ghosts. The bull is the symbol of Spain, the national symbol of Spain, kind of like the eagle in the United States. And here you see a bull that's been blown up, sort of symbolically the destruction of Spain. Young people around the world were upset about this civil war because rather than supporting the elected government of Spain against the fascists and against Hitler and Mussolini's intervention, the United States, Britain, France, and every other country in the world remained neutral, refusing to take sides, and in effect allowing Hitler to support the fascists to win. So many young people around the world were upset at their own governments and furious about what was happening in Spain that we saw volunteer groups of young people from all over the world flying into Spain and forming their own informal military groups to try to help the Republicans, the democratic government of Spain, regain power. This is a group of Americans in this picture. Some of the artists who participated in these efforts spent the rest of their life writing about it. You might know Hemingway, George Orwell, um, lots of amazing writing about this time. The end of it is, though, that they lost and the fascists took over Spain. Um, and Franco remained in power, and Spain remained a fascist country until 1975. Meanwhile, in Japan, the government of Japan was growing ever more fascist and ever more interested in taking colonies, building up their empire, their Pan-Asian empire, as they called it. Um, they had attacked, as you know, taken Korea and Taiwan, and then attacked northern Japan. I'm sorry, northern China, and moved into central China. And then in 1936, the Japanese began a campaign to take the rest of China with land attacks from the north and air attacks along the coast. The government of China, there wasn't really a government of China at the time that could respond, and that's because, as you might remember, there was a civil war in China between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, and the Nationalist Party had succeeded in pushing the Communist Party up into the hills in China. So it was only the Nationalists there when the Japanese attacked. The two parties joined forces to fight the Japanese, but for a while it looked like it was too late. The Japanese aerial campaign against China was, besides Guernica, the first time that the world had seen what aerial bombing could do, modern aerial bombing, and it was terrifying. This is a picture that appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Baby in the train station at Shanghai after his parents or her parents had been killed in the bombing. By the time that the Japanese forces were going inland to Nanjing, it was clear that this was a genocidal occupation. The Japanese were just killing Chinese people. They killed millions of Chinese people in very brutal fashion. This is the um, Capitol building in Nanjing. So many people who were killed, many of them were raped first. So not just killing, but humiliation, very horrible treatment of the Chinese. So the world saw this. It was not like a mystery to anyone. But France and Britain were occupied with what was going on in Europe. The United States was the only international organization that, and only other country really, that came to the aid of the Chinese. And even then, the United States strategy was to send weapons, not troops, and only to the nationalists, not to the communists, which meant that our intervention was almost insignificant in terms of how it affected things. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Hitler had bigger ambitions besides just taking the Rhineland. He wanted to unite all German-speaking people, and he particularly wanted to rejoin Germany with Austria, the country of his birth. Austrians speak German. In Hitler's mind, they're all German. So after a several-year campaign of intimidation and terrorism against Austrian leaders, the Austrian parliament actually voted to join with Germany in what was called the Anschluss. That's 1938, and you might have thought that this obvious violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles would have brought a worldwide reaction. But in fact, France and Britain kind of said, well, maybe that's what the Austrians wanted. Maybe it's all they really need. We should just, we don't want to get provoked by small things in small countries. So they let it go. There was a huge celebration in Austria as Hitler was rejoined with the country of his birth. But of course, you had to be involved in the celebration and be happy, otherwise you ended up in prison. And the abuse and killing of Jewish Austrians began almost right away. This is a scene during the Anschluss celebrations where Austrian Jews were being forced to clean the sidewalk with brushes, just a humiliation, a bullying. Um, the world knew about this, but it wasn't a big factor in people's decision making about how to treat Germany. After all, anti Semitism is a worldwide phenomenon. The US didn't want any refugees who were Jewish from Europe and refused them. And so um, the world turned a blind eye to what Germany was doing. Naturally, Austria isn't all that Germany wanted. So if you look at this map, you can see the Rhineland that they've recovered, Austria. But the next target for Hitler was this area of Czechoslovakia, which had formerly been part of Germany and which had a lot of German speaking people. So Hitler's argument was that these German speaking people were being tortured and abused by the Czechoslovakians. There's no evidence of that. But he needed to go in and rescue them. And he did an unusual thing. He announced directly to the governments of France and Britain, he said, I'm going in, I'm going to take back this area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, and I expect you to do nothing about it because it's my last thing that I'm going to take. So would you like to come and talk? Why do you think Hitler would have invited France and Britain to come and talk about this? Some people think he was deliberately testing them, probing them to see if they would react. What they did was they went to Germany. The government, this is Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, and the Prime Minister of France meeting with Hitler in Germany at Hitler's invitation, without any Czechoslovakians present, and they agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland with the written promise that he would stop taking land at this point. Neville Chamberlain said, "This is a deal that will get us peace in our time." But this kind of arrangement where you give away something to an aggressor in the hopes of stopping them from being aggressive, which is called appeasement, is not recognized as a successful strategy by very many people. If you think about it, maybe have you ever been shopping with a little kid and you go to the grocery store? There's the candy right by the cash register. Kids always want to have the candy. You probably have been in this situation. If you have, maybe you've thought about it. If you give the kid the candy and you say, like, hey, that's it, you can get anything else, you get 5 minutes of peace. But on the other hand, they tend to expect you to give them candy every single time they're in the grocery store. So this idea of appeasement, of giving an aggressor something to get them to stop, in retrospect, it looks a little naive. And in fact, Hitler didn't just take the Sudetenland. This is a comic cartoon by a European cartoonist. You can see that he or she has a different opinion of this situation. They've drawn Neville Chamberlain down here giving up Czechoslovakia like it's bait for a rat, and the rat is obviously Hitler. I find this guy in the background kind of interesting. Is he the United States still staying neutral and watching all this happen? Is he a wealthy British or French person who maybe doesn't mind Hitler because he's anti-communist? Who knows? But in fact, that's what really happened. Hitler took all of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland. This is the German army rolling into Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, in 1939. So you would think, okay, this is the moment where clearly Hitler's gone too far. He just broke the agreement made in Munich just a few days after it had been made. So now France and Britain will react. In fact, what they did was they wrote letters saying, don't do that. We're very angry, and please don't take Poland. The United States immediately announced that we were neutral. And it looked like Hitler was going to get away with Czechoslovakia, no problem. Think about how this might have looked from the perspective of the Soviets. So here's the Soviet Union, and here is the newly expanded Germany. Only thing between Germany and the Soviet Union right now is Poland. And Are France and Britain going to stop Germany? It doesn't look like it. Is anyone going to stop Germany? It doesn't look like it. So Stalin has to start thinking for his own benefit here. And the thought was, maybe we could make a deal with Germany. You will understand that historically, the problem Germany has is that they can become surrounded by enemies on both sides. So maybe Germany would be interested in having a friend on the east side so that it would not have to worry about its eastern border. Stalin pursued that conversation and, in fact, was able to make a deal. So in this picture, you see Stalin, the leader of Soviet Russia, and Ribbentrop, negotiator for the Nazis. And their agreement was publicly, what the world knew, was that they had agreed to non-aggression, to not fight, not becoming allies, just they had agreed to not fight. Privately, they made a deal to split Poland. And that's what led to the invasion of Poland. So these are German tanks invading Poland. The invasion of Poland was an example of what the Germans called a blitzkrieg strategy of war, fast attacks on many, many fronts using ground troops, but also simultaneously using air troops and attacks from the sea. It's quite overwhelming and scary. Poland fell to the Germans within 6 weeks. And then, midway through September, this is September of 1939, Russia invaded Poland from the east and took the other half of Poland. At this point, France and Britain finally declared war on Germany, but they did not come to the rescue of Poland in any kind of serious or sustained way. What they did, in fact, was they began to prepare their own defenses. So people call this the Sitzkrieg, or a phony war. France and Britain were just waiting for Germany to attack rather than going on the offensive. While the Russian forces were taking their half of Poland, they also took all the countries north of Poland that had previously been part of the Russian Empire. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then Finland. And I wanted to show you this picture of Finland just because the Finns are so amazing. Check it out. They fight in snow camo on skis. And the Finns were able to hold out against the Russians for a couple of months. But the rest of the countries, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they couldn't hang on for even a few weeks. Hitler was not going to stop. He immediately began planning the invasion of France. And the strategy here, like in World War I, was to avoid, I'm going to move this so you can see, to avoid the defenses that the French had planned along their border with Germany, and instead attack France from the north through the countries of Luxembourg and Belgium. Again, the idea was to use what's called a blitzkrieg attack with many different forces moving at the same time, with air forces coordinating with ground forces, and with an ocean attack at the same time. You can see in the next picture that troops up here in northern France were cut off by this fast-moving German attack and actually pushed into the ocean at Dunkirk. So you might have seen the movie Dunkirk, which came out a year, 2 years ago. These are British, mostly, troops that had been stationed in France being pushed out into the ocean to get away from Germans. And they were rescued by, some of them were rescued by British ships, often fishermen and pleasure cruises that stopped to, went out of their way and went into great danger to pick up endangered soldiers. One of the side stories here is that British soldiers were rescued a lot, most of them, but French and Indian troops that were fighting on behalf of the British were abandoned for the most part on the beaches. And so the story that you see in the movie is a little bit whitewashed, ignoring the fate of the Indian troops. And there's a great article about that in the New York Times that is linked in this slideshow if you want to read it. This is Hitler in Paris. Once the German troops had taken Paris, they pretty much had control of France. Um, there was a French resistance that fought all through World War II, like local people, a loose band of spies and freedom fighters. But basically, Germany controlled France for the rest of the war. So if you can imagine now, um, World War II has officially started, but even just as France and Britain declared war on Germany and Italy, they were already losing. They'd already lost France, they'd already lost most of Europe. And it's hard to overstate the sense of desperation and fear that gripped Europe at this time. I think sometimes because Americans know that Germany ultimately did not win, they forget that it looked for a long time like they were going to win. Um, and then, of course, only Britain and Greece are left in Europe, and then the Germans began to bomb Britain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next lesson. Um, how did Russia end up getting into the war? As you might remember, they they thought they had a deal with Germany that they had agreed not to fight. But by 1941, so 1940, Germans took France. 1941, Britain was not giving in, and Hitler had run out of things to attack. And he hated the Russians. So, against the advice of his own advisors, he launched an attack on Russia. This was a surprise to the Russians, and they weren't prepared for it at all. And so they experienced a lot of losses. Here you can see a German tank rolling past Russian Orthodox Church. The Russians were so surprised and so unable to handle the German blitz that they were forced to retreat. What you see here is a Russian soldier, and they're laying dynamite on the tracks here of a railroad. What the Russians did was, as they retreated, they blew up their railroads, they blew up their factories, they blew up their bridges, um, they burned down their own fields. And so, in retreat, the only thing that they could do was make sure that the Germans didn't get any Russian assets or supplies to help them when they occupied Russia. Meanwhile, Japan had been cleaning up in Asia and setting their eyes on more colonies to the south of China. The United States tried to stop them, partly by arming the Chinese resistance a little, and partly by boycotting. Well, how do you call that? Blockading Japan from getting access to American oil and American metals, and from trading with the outside world. This just made the Japanese more determined to take these colonies because they could get supplies from those colonies. Um, and another thing they were trying to do was to cut off the supply of weapons and resources to the Chinese by cutting off this sort of southern connection to the sea. Um, so the Japanese knew what they wanted to do, and they knew that the United States would be the main resistance to them. France and Britain were not a factor. They were involved in the war in Europe, so the U.S. is the only enemy, and you have to think about it from the Japanese point of view. Do they want to wait for the U.S. to eventually get mad enough to get into a war with them, or would they rather start a war with the United States on their own terms and in their own time? They decided for the later, and so the Japanese targeted the U.S. military base in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, where they were able to attack and take out a huge part of the United States Navy in the Pacific in a single one-day attack in December of 1941. This brought the United States into the war. So finally, the United States declared war on um, Germany, Italy, and Japan. But it also meant that the United States came into the war with a lot less military capacity. And as a result, Japan was able to attack the American colony at the Philippines and take it within a month because the United States troops there had no support from the mainland. So by the end of 1941, this is the situation in the world. Uh, Germany and Italy have pushed into Russia here. And you remember from our study of Russia that this is the important part of Russia, where all of the fields are, where all of the farming happens. Um, so this is a huge blow to the Soviet Union. Um, Germany is now in possession of all of France's colonies in Africa, in addition to France itself. Um, it should show here that Italy had Ethiopia, and then Japan has control of the entire eastern seaboard of the main land areas in Asia. And so even as World War II is beginning, it looks really bad for the Allies, who are now Russia, the United States, Britain, and the French government in exile. So that the story of how that gets turned around is what we'll focus on next week. But your assignment for this week is to think about, was there a way to stop this? And if so, when would it have been done and how would it have been done? And just think of one thing you might have done differently and write me a paragraph about it. I will talk to you next week.